The smell is the first symptom, not the smell of the sick, but of the building itself, the walls exhaling something that has no name in any of the 6 languages spoken on this block. New York, 1849, the 5-point slum, second cholera epidemic in 17 years, and the people of Mulberry Bend have already learned that the city will not come for them until the disease crosses into a neighborhood where the landlords vote. The water comes from the well at the corner of Anthony Street, shared by 400 people, and on certain mornings it carries a cloudiness the older residents recognize. The women who were here in 1832 have watched this cloudiness before, and they know what follows it. The Irish widow on the 2nd floor boils every drop before it touches her children's mouths, a habit carried from a village in Cork where a priest told them to boil the water during a fever season, not knowing the science, only that it worked. The Italian family on the 4th floor arrived 3 months ago and has not yet learned about the well. They drink it cold because cold water on a July afternoon is the one mercy this city has offered, and the mercy will cost them. The rag picker who works the alley before dawn moves differently on mornings after rain, his route adjusted to avoid the pooled water near the courtyard drain. The geography of his avoidance learned from watching where the last man who ignored it ended up. A child on the 1st floor runs a fever on a Thursday, and by Saturday, the mother carries her to the dispensary on Chambers Street, where a doctor examines her for 6 minutes and sends her home with a bottle that costs 40 cents and does nothing. 40 cents is 2 hours of piecework. The laundress across the hall sews through the night to replace it when her own daughter falls sick the following week. This is the 5-point slum in the cholera years. Not a place where people die without trying, but a place where trying happens in conditions designed to make it fail. The disease does not care about effort. It only cares about water. Tuberculosis moves differently than cholera, not in sudden waves that empty a building in a week, but in a slow occupation, room by room, season by season, gradual enough that families sometimes cannot name the moment it arrived. The tenements of Mulberry Bend were its ideal architecture. Ceilings too low for a tall man to stand straight, windows facing brick walls 4 feet away, air shafts connecting every floor into a single shared lung, the breath of 200 people circulating through spaces too small to dilute it. The bacterium traveled in that shared air, in the warmth of bodies pressed together through winter, in the darkness of rooms where sunlight reached the floor for 20 minutes a day, and no more. The seamstress on the 3rd floor coughs through October and November and tells herself it is the autumn damp, because the alternative to telling herself that is a truth she cannot afford to act on. The sanatorium costs money she does not have. The room costs money she cannot stop paying, and the piecework stops the moment her hands stop moving. Her hands keep moving, the cough deepens. By January, her face has lost a quality hard to name precisely. Not color exactly, but something behind the color, some interior light that has been slowly withdrawing since September. The children on her floor have learned not to look at her directly in the hallway. Not from cruelty, but from the specific superstition of people who live close enough to illness to treat it the way sailors treat certain words at sea. The consumption ward at Bellevue Hospital accepted patients when beds were available, which in most winters of the 5-point slum epidemic years, they were not. The doctor who visited Mulberry Bend twice a year advised fresh air and rest, 2 things available in abundance to people who did not live in the 5-point slum and virtually nowhere else. The seamstress sewed through February. By March, the corner she had occupied was available for the next tenant, who moved in on a Saturday and did not ask what had happened to the previous one. The city of New York understood by 1866 that disease moved through water and air and proximity. The pattern was visible enough that the Metropolitan Board of Health had been created precisely to interrupt it. The board had authority over the 5-point slum in theory. In practice, it had 14 inspectors for a city of 1 million people, and the tenement landlords who appeared before the board's hearings were frequently the same men present at the ward meetings where the board's funding was discussed. The inspection reports from Mulberry Bend in the 1860s and 1870s read like a catalog of what was known and not acted upon. Privy vaults overflowing into basement apartments, water pipes sharing walls with drainage lines, cellars occupied by families in rooms with standing water on the earthen floor. The inspector wrote his report. The landlord received a notice. The notice produced a partial repair, visible enough to close the complaint and insufficient to change the conditions that generated it. Then the inspector moved to the next block, and the cycle restarted. Jacob Riis arrived with his camera in 1888, and the photographs he took in the cellars of Mulberry Bend showed what the inspection reports had described for 20 years, but with faces attached, which changed something in the public conversation that decades of written reports had entirely failed to change. What Riis photographed was not the dying. The 5-point slum did not perform its mortality for cameras, but the specific conditions that made dying statistically certain for certain populations living in certain rooms at certain densities. The infant mortality rate in the 5 Points district in 1870 stood at 320 deaths per 1,000 live births. 1 in 3 children born in those tenements did not reach their second birthday. The city recorded these numbers every year and published them in its annual reports, which were read by the kinds of people who read annual reports. And the Mulberry Bend tenements continued to fill with new arrivals who had not been told what the numbers said. If this glimpse into their real story moves you, leave a like to honor their resilience. The people of the 5-Point slum were not passive in the face of disease. They had developed, across the decades of the epidemic years, a dense practical knowledge of illness that operated entirely outside the formal medical system, because the formal medical system had made clear it did not intend to reach them. The Italian women on Mulberry Street had brought from Calabria and Sicily a detailed understanding of which plants reduced fever and which poultices drew infection. Knowledge assembled over centuries in villages where the nearest physician was a full day's journey by foot. The Irish families carried their own equivalents, remedies their grandmothers had used during the fever years, adapted to the specific diseases of New York, amended by whatever the neighbor 2 floors up had found to work on the same symptoms the previous winter. The German widow on Baxter Street had worked as a midwife for 20 years and knew more about infection and survival in childbirth than most physicians who delivered babies in the 5 Points dispensaries, because she had attended 400 births in these rooms and they had attended 40 in clean hospital wards. This knowledge passed between women at the courtyard pump, in the mission chapel waiting rooms, on the front stoops on summer evenings, shared in 6 languages, translated imperfectly but urgently, because urgency was the permanent condition of a neighborhood where illness arrived without appointment and left without asking permission. The settlement nurses who arrived in the 1880s walked up the same rotting stairs the landlord's inspector had climbed and stayed longer, and came back the following week. Women who treated the sick in the rooms where the sick actually lived. Lillian Wald, who founded the Henry Street settlement in 1895, kept meticulous records of every household she visited and every illness she treated. The most detailed portrait of disease in the immigrant tenements of New York that survives. Her records show, above everything else, that the people of the 5 Point slum were not dying from ignorance. They were dying from the specific, documented conditions of rooms they could not afford to leave. Subscribe to Memories Reanimated to keep walking these streets with us. The worst of the Mulberry Bend tenements were cleared through the 1890s and replaced with the small park that still stands there, and the tuberculosis wards of Bellevue received more beds, and the water mains of the 5 Point slum were replaced, and the infant mortality rate in Lower Manhattan began, slowly and unevenly, to fall. The people who had lived through the cholera years and the tuberculosis decades did not receive a certificate of survival. They received, if fortunate, a different address, in a building slightly less overcrowded, in a block slightly less contaminated, with slightly more access to a physician who might or might not come. Some carried the physical consequences for the rest of their lives, the shortened breath of a lung healed imperfectly, the hearing lost to a childhood fever, the hand missing 2 fingers to an infection that adequate care would have cleared in a week. Their children grew up knowing the smell of a building where someone was sick, the particular silence of a floor where a death had recently occurred, the way a family rearranges itself around an absence, knowledge absorbed before they were old enough to name what they were learning. The grandchildren of the 5 Points slum became, among other things, the generation that built the American labor movement, the public health infrastructure, the settlement house network, institutions designed to prevent the exact conditions their grandparents had survived. This is not coincidence. It is causation. The direct line between a childhood watching what happens when a city decides certain lives need no protection, and an adulthood spent building the systems that change that decision. The bend in Mulberry Street still curves at Bayard, and Columbus Park sits where the worst of the tenements stood. And on summer mornings, the elderly residents of Chinatown play cards at the tables near the north entrance, unhurried, in the sun. The air is different now. The water is clean. The buildings breathe. They held, they built, they became. Join Memories Reanimated. Subscribe to keep these stories alive. And tell us in the comments, from which country did your ancestors travel to find a new life?